It's Friday, May 5th, 2017, and you're listening to State of Vape in Canada. Reach us at stateofvapeshow@gmail.com. Yes, this week in State of Vape in Canada, we bring you a two-part interview. That's right, two-part interview. In our first part, we speak with someone who's been working on research on e-cigarette harm reduction since late 2011. We are going to speak with Dr. Konstantinos Farsalinos. Very well known and highly regarded. You can read his research at www.ecigarette-research.org. And for our second part, we speak with David Sweanor, who has worked extensively in public policy, working on the reduction of cigarette smoking, as well as an outspoken supporter of e-cigarettes as a harm reduction option. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Farsalinos. Very glad to have you here. Could you take a moment to briefly introduce yourself to our listeners who maybe haven't had a chance to get to know some of the work you've been involved with?
Well, hello, John. Thank you very much for the invitation. I've been doing research on e-cigarettes and harm reduction in general since 2011, late 2011. I've been involved in research both in terms of safety and risk assessment of e-cigarettes and exposure to toxins from e-cigarettes compared to smoking, and other aspects of e-cigarette research like population studies and so on. I have more than 50 publications in peer-reviewed international scientific journals, and we are continuing this journey of advancing knowledge and research about e-cigarettes.
I believe recently you were in Canada for a conference on vaping regulation and the law. I think
Yes.
that was the title. What
Yes.
are some of the highlights from that visit to Canada? And do you have any advice for us as we struggle through going through the Senate with new laws regarding Bill S5? I don't know if there's anything you know about that ever since your visit to Canada, but what are your thoughts?
Well, first of all, it's a positive thing that the Canadian regulatory authorities have acknowledged that it was a mistake to blindly ban nicotine-containing cigarettes, and that was the decision in the past, although it was not really enforced and implemented. For start, it's a positive thing. And I have always supported the need for regulation throughout the world. So it's a positive thing that the authorities want to regulate e-cigarettes without banning them. Because some people think that regulation is also, that a ban is also regulation, but it's not.
Right.
However, seeing in more detail the proposals, it is, I would say, a bit disappointing. It's not the worst case scenario, of course, but it is disappointing, especially because the purpose of the regulation, there was a list of 5 or 6 purposes of why they should create a regulation for cigarettes.
Yes.
And unfortunately, none of them included the word smoker or smoking. So, there is only one reason why e-cigarette exists. It is to be used as a substitute for smoking, for harm reduction. So the regulation should be based on this aspect. And of course, cover issues like quality control, quality criteria, of course, how the product is going to be marketed, because we want it to be a product addressed to smokers as a means of reducing or ideally quitting smoking. Unfortunately, it was all the purposes were about protecting people who don't really need to be protected because they are not in any danger. Of course, I accept that kids, youth, adolescents need to know that this is not a new trendy habit for them to follow. But let's not forget that there are also kids who are smoking. And for them, it could be a solution. Now, I fully support the need for evidence-based regulation. And I can discuss and present a very long list of theoretical concerns, but I can also tell you that the evidence until now suggests that none of these concerns are a reality. So yes, the reason we continue to do research and we continuously monitor the situation is to make sure that all these theoretical concerns are monitored and are addressed. But to make a regulatory decision, you need, first of all, to be flexible because it's a product that changes all the time. And second, you need to use currently available evidence. And of course, you may have some precautionary measures, but over-restricting the product based on no evidence and just purely theoretical, legitimate but theoretical concerns is not a good idea. In fact, it is an abuse of the precautionary principle because even the precautionary principle requires the presence of some preliminary data based on which you apply a precautionary approach in the regulation. Right now, the data in Canada and worldwide is that e-cigarettes are used predominantly by smokers and former smokers. There is absolutely minimal use by never smokers, and the same is true for kids. There may be some experimentation, and this is something that needs to be addressed, but there is no regular daily use, which could pose some risk to people if they have never smoked or if they, by any chance, transition from e-cigarette use to smoking.
Right. So in all, Bill S5, the intent is going.
In general, yes. In general, I must say that I think that the mentality should change. I think the approach to the product should change. I think that they are approaching a product as a new type of tobacco cigarette, and that's not the case. It's not just another consumer product which is going to expose users to some risks. It is a product that has been very successfully used by millions of smokers worldwide who have managed to quit or at least reduce their smoking consumption. So there are specific benefits for specific population subgroups, and we must ensure that these population subgroups continue to have the right to less harmful products, and of course, at the same time, apply some regulation to protect other population subgroups, but always looking at the greater picture, so the net population effect, which until now, and even in the absence of regulation, it has been very positive everywhere. We must acknowledge and admit that.
And my personal experience has only been positive. I was smoking for 25 years, and although, my experience is anecdotal, I'd like you maybe to tell me afterwards if maybe this applies to the general population. But I had childhood asthma. And so every night until I switched to vaping, I would take my asthma pump because I'm allergic to dust mites. So when I go to sleep, it triggers a bit of difficulty in breathing, and I take my pump. My doctor said, as long as you don't quit smoking, you're always going to live with that. And lo and behold, I switched to vaping. And 1 month or 2 months later, I don't need the pump. It's been 2 years now. I haven't used my Ventolin pump in 2 years. And I feel better. I can taste everything. I can run up the stairs. I could keep up with my daughter. Is that what we also see among the general population, that they have a net health benefit in their life when they switch to vaping?
There are many anecdotal cases like this, but there is also a publication about asthmatics who are smoking and switch to e-cigarette use. And there has been a sustained improvement in respiratory function for at least 2 years follow-up. So yeah, besides the anecdotes, there are also publications on that. Of course, we need more evidence, and that's going to come through the years, but the preliminary data that we have are very, very positive indeed.
Mm-hmm. Now, I know you don't live in Canada, so you might not be up to speed, but maybe you have since you visited us recently. But in provinces like in Quebec, we've already went ahead with legislation. We can't compare e-cigarettes to smoking regular cigarettes. We can't vape in vape shops. We are basically lumped into the tobacco laws, and customers who come into a vape shop can't sample it. And within my own shop, I verified my numbers, and before the law came in, only half of the people who actually had a chance to try the flavors would actually come back. So there is a degree of difficulty and adaptation for someone who is even interested to switch. And now that they've imposed these laws, it's making it even more difficult. Have you had any information about the various situations in provinces, and what is your take on just lumping us in tobacco?
I know this case with Quebec, and I also understand what you say, because there are two main issues. First of all, e-cigarette is a much more complicated product to use compared to tobacco cigarette. And second of all, smoking is a difficult habit to quit. So it's perfectly understandable, and no one is saying that the e-cigarette can be successful in 100% of smokers, but applying additional burdens and obstacles to smokers making a successful switch is not a good idea. As I said before, it's a typical case of basically confusing e-cigarettes with tobacco cigarettes and approaching the cigarette as a new type of a tobacco cigarette. And this is not the case. Unless the regulators understand that, unfortunately, we're going to have such strange and wrong, I must say, decisions.
Right.
As I said, regulation is necessary, regulation is needed, even to protect the current consumers, the smokers who are using and former smokers who are using e-cigarettes, but the regulation should be proportionate, appropriate, and of course, totally different from tobacco cigarettes.
Right.
Otherwise, a smoker will get a message that it's the same thing. And if it's the same thing, why would any smoker want to switch?
I was going through your website recently, ecigaretteresearch.org.
Yes.
And I was just wondering, because in previous years you have posted many studies, but in 2016 there were a lot fewer. Is there any reason behind the posting?
It's the lack of time, basically. Unfortunately, it's a lack of time and doing a lot of, we don't have any funding. So I'm maintaining the website myself. Okay. I don't have any staff writing or even maintaining the website. So I do everything myself. As you understand, doing this, performing research, traveling to conferences, writing studies and publishing studies at the same time by one person is a very difficult task. So I'm at a point where there is total lack of time, and unfortunately I cannot fully support the website in the way that I wanted to.
So has most of your time been spent advocating and attending conferences as of late, and that's...
Basically attending conferences, presenting studies, and of course performing research and authoring and sending the studies for a review. I'm also a reviewer in something like 30 medical journals concerning e-cigarette research. So it's a lot of work which unfortunately cannot happen only by one. And unfortunately I don't have any funding, so we cannot expand the team.
There was one study, though, that 6.1 million Europeans have quit smoking through the use of electronic cigarettes. I think you did issue a press release on that study. Could you talk to us about that study and what it represents?
That was a survey performed by the European Union, by the European Commission, and it's the well-known Eurobarometer survey, which is performed every 1 or 2 years throughout the European Union. So in reality, it was not our study. We just obtained the data set from the European Commission because they release it publicly for researchers to do a secondary analysis. And we did exactly that. We performed a secondary analysis of the data set of a survey that was performed by the European Union and the European Commission.
How large was the study? Sorry to interrupt you. How large was this study, and is it comparable to other studies?
It was 27,800 participants with a personal interview and a very extensive questionnaire covering many more aspects other than smoking and cigarette use. But it included, for the first time, a very extensive evaluation of e-cigarette use and patterns of use and frequency of use and so on. So it was a very large survey from a very respected organizations, the European Commission. It was a representative of the general population, and that is why we were able to extrapolate numbers in the general population from the survey data. So the 6.1 million was an extrapolation from the data presented, evaluated in this data set, because the sample, the participants were a representative of the general population of the European Union.
Right. I think one of the things I took away from the study is that it showed that never smokers, the numbers at least, were very low in terms of picking up vaping.
It's very low, and especially when you look at regular vaping, for example, daily use was observed in less than 0.2% of participants. So it's basically 0.2% of never smokers. So it's basically zero. Daily nicotine use was reported by 0.08%. So again, that's zero basically. So, and these data are consistent with other studies in other countries that are showing that use by never smokers is minimal, and that's a very good thing. We don't want the cigarette to be attractive for non-smokers, for never smokers. And that is exactly what is happening. So we should be thankful for that.
So that essentially supports our argument that youth are not picking up smoking because they were also captured by this study, right?
This study included subjects, people 15 years old and older. We haven't done specific analysis of the sample of the participants aged 15 to 18 because the sample size is much smaller. But we have data on youth from other studies. I'm not sure in Canada, but we have in the UK, we have in the US. And everything is showing that, yes, there is some experimentation, but that's just ever use or recent experimentation. There is no daily or regular use. It's extremely low and it is largely confined in current and former smokers, not in never smokers.
And what is your take on the Royal College of Physicians saying that e-cigarettes is 95% healthier than cigarettes?
Okay, I think that it's... Yeah.
Yes, no, just because we often use that as the reason why we should continue to promote it as a harm reduction tool. And do you have any more information to bring to that? Is the study, did the study cover all the points that would satisfy a scientist like you to say, to claim the same statement?
Public Health England, the Royal College of Physicians have a duty to protect public health in the UK. So along the lines of protecting public health, a very important issue is providing proper and understandable information to the population so that they will make informed decisions. So just by saying that e-cigarettes are less harmful than smoking doesn't mean a lot. It's not a very clear message because they may be just slightly less harmful to a point that it doesn't make any real difference, or they may be tremendously less harmful. And even using terms like significantly, by far, or whatever, they are not creating a clear message. So it is very important to create a clear message for the population, and especially for the people who are not experts and are not able to understand the science through reading a scientific document. What these two organizations, Public Health England and the Royal College of Physicians, did was an extensive review of the literature, and based on currently available evidence, and specifically on the difference between the levels of toxins present in e-cigarette aerosol vapor compared to the levels of toxins in tobacco cigarette smoke, they came up with a very reasonable, I must say, estimate that e-cigarettes are probably 95% less harmful, or even lower than that, more than that. I think it's a very reasonable estimate, which is not based on long-term evidence, because we can't have long-term evidence yet. So I understand that ideally we should have long-term epidemiological studies, but this is something that cannot happen right now. So I think it's irresponsible to hide the level of information that we have right now until the time we do we get some information from long-term epidemiological studies. I think it is important for the public to know the current level of knowledge and of level of information. And I think that this is a very reasonable estimate of the harm difference that the general population needs to know. So, as I said, they're going to make informed decisions.
So could we say, although we don't have the long-term studies, if someone is smoking cigarettes for 25 years versus someone smoking e-cigarettes, can we say today that the long-term impact will definitely be safer? Or because we don't have those studies, we can't make that claim just yet?
We will avoid the word definitely, but we have to tell him that based on what we know until now, it is going to be very beneficial for their health.
Okay. And with the rapidly changing technologies that we touched upon earlier, some of these kits now that are being sold are dispensing a lot more vapor than in the past. So is that going to change? Does that affect at all any of the previous studies that may have used some older kits that would emit half or a fraction of the vapor? Does that impact the overall? Is it still going to be healthier despite the fact that it's emitting 2 or 3 times the amount of vapor?
The problem is not how much vapor any cigarette emits, but how much a vapor is consuming on a daily basis. Having more efficient devices is a good thing, because it's going to make it easier for a smoker to make the switch. But multiplying your daily consumption is not a good idea. I know many vapers who have transitioned from the conventional, let's say, type of vaping, which is the mouth-to-lung inhalation, to direct lung inhalation, and that was accompanied by tripling, quadrupling, or even more their daily consumption. Now, it would be naive for anyone to think that by multiplying your consumption, you're going to have the same risk and the same level of toxin exposure compared to what you did previously. It's pretty naive, because you can understand in any other issue in daily life that when you exceed the limits, or you exceed what we consider moderation, you are increasing your risk. The amount of toxins are directly related to the amount of liquid you consume on a daily basis. It's very simple. Now imagine that instead of the average 1.5 to 2 liters of water per day, someone would drink 8 liters of water per day. That would be very dangerous for his or her health. So even water can be very dangerous when you multiply your consumption. If someone is smoking 5 cigarettes, going to 20 cigarettes is definitely going to increase the risk. So the same is going to apply to e-cigarettes. Yes, there is a low risk, but this risk is multiplied directly depending on the level of consumption. So vapers need to understand that, and vapers who have been vaping 3 or 5 milliliters per day 3 years ago and are now vaping 15 or 20 milliliters per day, and that's becoming quite common among, the dedicated vapers. They need to understand that they are multiplying their exposure to toxic chemicals. That's a fact.
Is there any study that shows how much? Like,
there is no need to have any study on that. The more you consume, the more it's going to be the exposure. When we measure toxins per gram of liquid consumption. So, as you understand, the more grams, the more the exposure. That's it. That's how it happens.
So is that actually something that our regulators, government in Canada should look at in terms of when they come out with a set of regulations?
They cannot look at that. How can you regulate how much you're going to eat and how much you're going to drink? You can't.
You can't, I guess, what if you just set the number of watts a device can use? I know it'd be extremely difficult. It would be
that's useless and a very problematic decision, because different devices require different power setups. So how are you going to define a single level of power delivery that is going to be suitable for everything? It doesn't work like that. It's impossible for this to happen.
Are there any upcoming studies that you're working on or that we should look out for?
We have a lot of studies underway, both on safety, several studies on aldehyde emissions, and we do have some population studies evaluating youth use in the US. We have also prepared a document criticizing the recent Surgeon General report on e-cigarettes, the US Surgeon General report on e-cigarettes, that has already been submitted for publication, and hopefully it will be published soon, we hope. We do quite a lot of things in all areas of cigarette research.
When I've seen quite a few recommendations to correct others' reports or scientific studies, have they ever answered you positively in any way and kept an open mind to correct or apply some of the recommendations you bring?
No. You have to understand that this is a very hostile environment, even in science, and that's what I'm saying is a very unfortunate thing. But I must tell you, and I cannot be more specific, that even the journals who are publishing these studies, and we are submitting a replication disputing the claims and the findings of these studies, instead of being glad with replication of research, they reject our studies. And this is, in my opinion, a direct and very clear attempt for censorship. And this is exactly the environment in the scientific community, and that's very unfortunate, that we are living in. As I said, I cannot be more specific, but this is creating huge problems. This is creating horror stories coming from reckless studies, and I'm very sorry for using the term reckless, but that's exactly what it is. And unfortunately, the scientific community is not willing to acknowledge this recklessness. So it is a very difficult environment. And although I was expecting that over the years things would get much better, unfortunately, things are getting much worse.
Will there be a point at which the true science will come out, the legitimate science will come out?
The truth science is going to come out in any case, because thankfully we have so many journals that eventually everything is going to be published. But the thing is that with this delay or with choosing other journals, we are missing the point, because these horror studies that are coming out are always accompanied by press statements, and the journalists are very willing to report horror stories, and these stories are more popular to the people. So eventually we are seeing deception of the population through the studies and the accompanied press statements.
Am I correct to say that some have even gone to the extent of trying to discredit you and say that you're funded by various interests that make you biased at some points?
Our funding sources are very transparently presented in all our publications, very transparently. So, of course, there is an attempt to discredit everyone who has a positive opinion on e-cigarettes. Everyone. I'm not the exception. I am also part of the rule. And unfortunately for them, they will fail. Of course, the problem is that the inability to get funding from industry sources, inability because of this climate, makes it harder to do more research, because research needs money. But we are struggling, we are trying, we are doing a lot of work. I must say that we could have done more, yes. But at least that's what we're going to do. We're going to keep on like this, and we're not going to give them the opportunity to mislead the public by discussing about alleged conflicts instead of discussing about evidence. Because in science, the first matter and the first issue that should be discussed is evidence. So the lack of argument is making several people focus the discussion only on alleged conflicts and not on the evidence.
Mm-hmm. And coming from a country where the health minister smokes, I think you shared a picture once of the health minister in Greece. I think he was
the deputy health minister smoking inside the health ministry during a press conference.
That must be extremely disappointing for you.
The biggest disappointment was that Greece applied the stronger restrictions on e-cigarettes compared to any other country, and this is quite a paradox, especially for a country where the smoking prevalence in the adult population is 38%, and it's almost 50% among males. So we are by far the country with the highest prevalence of smoking in the European Union, one of the highest in the world, and the ministry thought it would be a good idea to apply as many restrictions as possible to e-cigarettes. Things that don't even make any sense at all, things that defy logic, because at the same time you have tobacco cigarettes legally available everywhere, literally everywhere, within walking distance, and you are applying more restrictions to e-cigarettes instead of creating a competitive advantage for e-cigarettes.
Did they give any reasons why they needed to implement such measures?
There is no need to discuss on specifics, but they do have the usual excuse that it might be attracting kids, that people who don't smoke may start with e-cigarettes and then transition to smoking. All, as I said, all these theoretical concerns that are far from the truth and far from what's happening today when you look at the evidence.
So
the excuse is the same everywhere, it doesn't change.
Right.
The arguments are the same everywhere, and unfortunately, the problem is that the arguments are not evidence-based at all. They're just theoretical concerns.
Do we have any data showing how youth are actually picking up smoking? What is the gateway? What is the path they take to start smoking?
We do have a lot. First of all, the increase in popularity of e-cigarettes has been accompanied by the biggest decline in smoking among youth. So where is the problem of people, kids being attracted to e-cigarettes and then transitioning to smoking? Where is that? Mm-hmm. When you look at the smoking rates in adolescents, everywhere we are seeing the biggest declines ever observed in the last few years.
So these youth or teenagers or young folks that are going, that would have regularly used a cigarette in the past are trying perhaps an e-cigarette, but not becoming regular users of e-cigarettes.
The main issue is what's happening with kids who don't smoke. And the biggest risk is for kids who don't smoke to start using e-cigarettes and then transition to regular smoking. And this is not happening. And we have evidence that this is not happening. The studies that the regulatory authorities themselves are doing are showing that there is nothing like that happening. Mm-hmm. That was the basis of our critique to the Surgeon General report, which, as I said, I hope it's going to be published soon. And you're going to see an evidence-based critique. So it's not just, theories and thoughts. It's what the evidence is showing concerning youth use of e-cigarettes and smoking.
Right. And again, with my anecdotal evidence, I picked up smoking because I used to steal cigarettes from my mom. I never went to a store to pick up cigarettes, so it would have helped if my mom was a bit more cautionary and kept her cigarettes away or tried to avoid, or like educating me and tell me, John, don't pick this up, don't start smoking. I don't know if that's another path that people start smoking where they're influenced by the immediate people surrounding them.
You know that one of the strongest predictors of a kid becoming a smoker in the future is having parents who are smoking. So I understand your situation, and it's quite a common situation that has been observed through research on the factors that predict future smoking. And that's quite common.
Yeah, it's as if the government here has completely ignored that and just opted through a fear that smoking cigarettes would be renormalized in society through vaping, that they just imposed a whole bunch of restrictions.
Yes, and as I said, everyone, even those who are opposing e-cigarettes, the only reason they would be willing to accept the presence of e-cigarettes in the market is as a harm reduction tool. But the legislation and the regulations that they are proposing are basically preventing people from using e-cigarettes as a harm reduction tool. So that's a paradox that needs to change.
Well, I'd like to thank you again, Dr. Farsalinos, for joining me for this quick interview. And I just want to ask you, are there any closing thoughts you'd like to share with everyone, perhaps specifically to Canada, since this is for our Canadian communities?
I think that no one should lose faith. We are doing our best to present the evidence and the research the way it is. And it is a very difficult task. It is something that's not going to stop soon. The situation and the controversy is going to continue. But the only thing we can do is continue using evidence, using research, generating knowledge. I understand that it's also a political battle. And unfortunately, in some cases, it's becoming more politics and less science. But the only way we can and we should fight that is through science. And of course, even through exposing the problems that exist with e-cigarettes, because through science, we have the opportunity to make the cigarette even safer than it is right now. And I see nothing bad in publishing bad research for e-cigarettes. I've done it in the past. I have been criticized for that, as if I have revealed some kind of a secret. I mean,
is that in reference to
it's
the
not
dry?
gonna be.
Is the dry burning the one about dry burning your coils? Perhaps
No,
one
no,
of the
we,
examples.
we haven't done any research on that. That was just a personal opinion that I said, and I clearly mentioned that that's a personal opinion.
Mm-hmm.
I'm talking about the diacetyl study that we published 2 years ago. The study on sweet flavors containing diacetyl in many of the samples we tested.
Right.
And I was criticized then. I have no regrets at all. I will do the same study again if I get the opportunity and the funding to do so, because I think that it is important. Any wrongdoings and anything bad in e-cigarettes needs to be exposed and corrected.
So I know we were going to end the call, but now you got me curious. What was the main finding? That there was high levels of diacetyl, that it was alarming? What exactly was what did you observe in that study?
I think you need to do some research on diacetyl to understand the background. Diacetyl is a flavoring which is approved for use in food flavors, and it is perfectly safe to ingest it, but it's not safe to inhale it because it has been observed that it causes respiratory dysfunction and a specific disease called popcorn lung disease. So in my opinion, and that's a clear opinion that I had since the time we did the study and even now, is that diacetyl should not be used at any levels in e-liquids. We tested 159 samples from the US and Europe. We found diacetyl or acetylpropylene, which is a similar chemical, in 74% of the liquids, and we identified that as a perfectly avoidable risk. And when we say avoidable, it's just a matter of the companies making sure that they test their liquids and they remove diacetyl by reformulating the liquid. So, as we said, it's a perfectly avoidable risk. So there is no excuse that this risk exists. Because yes, diacetyl is also present in very large quantities in tobacco cigarette smoke, but in that case, it comes from the combustion, which means that you cannot avoid it because you can't smoke a cigarette unless you light a cigarette. In the case of e-cigarettes, it's not coming because of the evaporation process. It's coming because it is added as an ingredient in the liquids. And in my opinion, there is no excuse and no justification in doing that.
I believe many flavoring companies have moved to remove the diacetyl in their juices and created some new versions. Yeah.
I just hope, but I don't have the evidence to support that this has happened and to what extent it has happened.
Yeah. Are you in Washington right now, or are you in Greece?
No, I'm leaving for Washington on Sunday.
Oh, okay, and you're going to meet David Sweanor there as well, right? I think.
Probably yes.
All right. Thank you very much.
Bye, John. Thanks
Bye.
a lot.
Take care. That's it for the first part of the show. Now for our second part. This time we speak with, you guessed it, David Sweanor.
Hello.
Dr. Sweanor, thank you for accepting to speak with me.
Yeah, all good to chat.
So thank you for joining me today on the State of Vape in Canada. We have today with me Dave Sweanor joining me, a known advocate for harm reduction and promote the use of e-cigarettes. Dr. Sweanor, could you perhaps introduce yourself to our listeners today?
Hi, John. I'm David Sweanor. I've spent over a third of a century doing public policy work on reducing cigarette smoking. So starting the beginning of the 80s. And I've been very involved in a whole range of policy measures in Canada and globally, all the usual things we do to try to deal with any cause of death, injury, and disease. And that's things of, what do you do to prevent people from ever starting to smoke? What do you do to get people to be able to quit using the product? What do you do to protect third parties? And what do you do to reduce the harm for people who are still going to be using the product in some form or another? And a lot of that over the years has been controversial, but nothing more controversial than the whole idea of harm reduction, because we do run into very different worldviews, and I see it as a difference between the people who are pragmatically looking at how do you reduce death and disease, and the people who have an absolutist, abstinence-only sort of orientation, not so much that, we're going to save your lives as we're going to save your souls. We're going to tell you how to live, and you better do it. And I have a lot of trouble with that on issues of nicotine, as I do on other areas of public policy, whether we're talking about illicit drugs or sexual behavior or automobile use or anything else.
I believe you recently attended a conference in Canada entitled Vaping, Regulation, and the Law. Could you share a bit what went on in that conference and what was discussed?
Yes. That was a seminar. And that was Dr. Farsalinos, Ricardo Pelosa, and Derek from the Canadian Constitution Foundation, and Dr. Gaston Ostagui, who's a chest physician from Montreal. They were presenting, essentially summing up the state of science, the state of law. That there is, despite a lot of what people are saying, there's really no question but that vaping is almost certain to be massively less hazardous than cigarette smoking. And I'm talking to you from Washington, where I was speaking at a conference here yesterday, and having to deal with people who are still maintaining that, well, we don't really know. Well, we don't really know if the world's round by that sort of definition. So they made it very clear in the science, and Derek Frum made it very clear in terms of the law that, as Canadians, we have constitutional rights. The idea of a government forbidding truthful speech that can save lives, which was part of the intent behind current legislation, or that trying to deny Canadians access to a far less hazardous alternative to cigarettes, those are things that the government will have real trouble with because of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. So we combine what we know scientifically about massive differences in risk with what we know in terms of our rights about the ability to communicate that information, the ability to access products that are less hazardous.
Did you also have a chance to get information on the state of vape in Quebec, where they've basically just taken vaping or e-cigarettes and put it in with their tobacco laws, imposing many restrictions. And the Canadian Constitution Foundation, I believe, also wanted to pronounce and say that was a very bad decision in terms of making e-cigarettes less accessible. For example, we're not allowed to make any sales online. And so if anyone lives in a remote area, they can definitely go buy cigarettes very easily at their corner store, but they can't access a less harmful option as e-cigarettes. Have you gotten information about Quebec, and what are your thoughts around what they've done?
Oh yes, no, it gets a lot of attention, and I mean there's efforts on this globally, and often by people that I've worked with before on measures to try to reduce smoking. And it is that difference between people who are engaged on, how do we pragmatically reduce death and disease, and people who are really abstinence only. They just want to ban everything. And frankly, it just doesn't work. They're taking a quasi-religious view to this. And to try to treat things like vaping as if it's the same as smoking, it's just absolutely asinine. I mean, it's really like saying, if we're going to shut down restaurants that are selling undercooked hamburgers and have, dangerously unsanitary conditions, then we better shut down the restaurants that are cooking it well and have really sanitary conditions too, because we need to treat everybody the same.
Right.
And it's nonsense. I mean, the point is, one has to establish what's the goal. What is it we're trying to accomplish? And it is not up to public, it is not part of public health to say, my goal is simply to dictate how you live your life, and I'm going to force you to change in ways that happen to coincide with whatever my personal beliefs, ideology happen to be. I mean, what we do is we say, what we're trying to do is reduce death, injury, and disease as much as we practically can. And when you've got something like cigarette smoking that's killing, by Health Canada's estimates, just over 100 Canadians a day, and there's millions of Canadians who are smoking. And we know, based on the science and understanding the role of nicotine in terms of not just addiction, but self-medication, the various good things nicotine does for a lot of people, we're not going to get rid of it anytime soon. And the nicotine itself really isn't a significant problem. It's right up there with caffeine in terms of, how big a health problem, how much effort would we put into trying to deal with the drug itself. The problem's the delivery system. And we've known this for decades, that people are smoking for nicotine, they're dying from the smoke. And so what we've got is not only our leading cause of preventable death, but we have one that's just eminently solvable. This is simple. We deal with the delivery system. You deal with the delivery system, you've solved the problem. And instead, what we see in places like Quebec are people saying, oh my gosh, the problem is people using nicotine at all, and we're going to try to prevent it in any way that we can. And if we can reduce vaping, then we'll see that as a victory, rather than say, our goal is to reduce death and disease, and if we can reduce smoking, that's the victory.
Should it be concerning to us? In some of the hearings for Bill S5 in Canada, nicotine was referred as a toxic substance, and a very dangerous one at that.
Yeah, I think what you've got are people misconstruing the problem. So, yeah, if you want to say that there's toxins, there's something like 26 carcinogens in coffee. They're just not at a level that causes cancer. Caffeine is a toxic substance. Caffeine will kill you if you consume too much of it. But we don't worry too much about it because very few people are going to do that. And the same with nicotine, to say, does it have downsides? Everything does. Nothing is risk-free in life. But if you compare the ingestion of nicotine at the dosage level smokers are looking for with getting that nicotine from smoking a cigarette, it's the delivery system. So it'd be the same as if somebody was getting their caffeine from radioactive coffee or by smoking tea leaves. It's not the caffeine, it's the delivery system. And when people don't get that, when they do fear-mongering, as I just encountered here in the talk I was giving at the Food and Drug Law Institute conference in Washington yesterday, you have people who are still fear-mongering, saying, well, we really don't know that, maybe nicotine is causing a lot of heart disease and maybe it causes cancer. And the point is these questions were answered, and they were answered decades ago. And you've got people raising the same question again and again and again. And it's a sign the Enlightenment has just never reached these people. This is not about science. This is not about rationality. This is a core ideological belief. But they're letting their ideological positions impact the health and lives of millions of other people. And to the extent that they think the use of nicotine is somehow unethical and immoral, then isn't it a lot more unethical and a lot more immoral for them to impose their views in a way that causes people to use a more hazardous product that is much more likely to kill them and is indeed killing millions of people globally every year and 37 to 40,000 Canadians every year? This is entirely preventable. And I think there's a lot of responsibility that goes on the shoulders of the abstinence-only advocates, the people who are seeing this as a moralistic issue rather than a health issue. And they need to examine their own morality, their own views as to why would they do that? Why can't they look at what was accomplished in things like dealing with AIDS by acknowledging that, yes, people are going to have sex? Can we allow this to happen in a way that's less likely to kill people? We've done it on alcohol policy. We're doing it on drug policy. We've done it on automobiles. We've done it on industrial equipment. We've done it on food preparation. We've done it on pharmaceuticals. It's simple when we deal with tobacco. You just have to deal with the delivery system. We solve the problem. And when you've got provinces like Quebec being on the wrong side of this, doing things that make it less likely people will quit smoking, I think there's a lot of responsibility that goes on the shoulders of those people. They have an obligation to better understand the science, to pay attention to the ethics, and behave very differently than what we're doing now. If they do that, they solve an epidemic. What they're doing now is perpetuating one.
So their argument that vaping renormalizes smoking or that it's a gateway for youth, have there been any studies to support that?
Of course
those
not.
claims and those reasons?
Of course not. I mean, and they just keep mouthing these platitudes. And, you know, we get it from the abstinence-only people on all sorts of other things. You know, if you allow people to know about condoms, all sorts of kids are going to start having sex. You know, if you don't throw people in jail for long periods of time for possession of marijuana, then every soccer mom in town is going to become a heroin addict. I mean, it's just nonsense. It's been nonsense from the beginning. Any analysis of Gateway shows that, you know, there's just nothing behind that. You know, you'll get correlations that obviously somebody who's going to become a heroin addict is more likely to drink coffee than somebody who isn't. They're more likely to smoke dope than somebody who, you know, that doesn't go on to heroin addiction. It doesn't mean that drinking coffee causes heroin addiction. And all the evidence to date is the contrary, as one would expect, that when you provide less hazardous products, it dissuades people from doing the more hazardous thing. We're seeing a big fall in the youth smoking, coincident with the rise of vaping. It's what you would expect. And the whole idea of renormalization is simply an absurd argument that's been dismissed by, I think, anybody who's ever looked at it rationally. This is an entirely different thing that replaces smoking. It denormalizes smoking. You know, it's really like saying the provision of the safe automobiles we have now normalizes going out and buying the sort of cars that existed in 1962 that were deadly at any speed. Well, it doesn't. You know, the existence of new Apple computers normalizes people going out and buying Commodore 67s. They don't. The existence of, you know, modern cell phones normalizes people getting black rotary dial phones that you have to wind up. You know, we haven't seen that. The transition is invariably to products that are safer, they're more effective, they're cheaper. And the idea that people would move from a far less hazardous, far less expensive product that doesn't make you stink to saying, gee, what this really makes me want to do is try something that makes me stink, costs me a lot more money, and kills me. And we just don't see any evidence of that. And it's offensive to me that, and I just feel like I'm arguing with people who have a religious belief about something, or, you know, are absolutely committed to the idea that the world is flat. You can't penetrate them. They just keep saying the same nonsense again and again. You refute it, and it doesn't matter. They just keep saying it.
And so what are we supposed to do to change the minds of these people that are directing and managing our policies and our laws, and so that we don't end up with a situation where this amazing opportunity to reduce the harms of cigarettes becomes less and less available? What could we possibly do more than just, you know, studies and trying to educate them when it seems like you're talking to a brick wall?
Well, I think noise is important. I mean, I've been involved in political reform all my life. How do you get laws changed? I think vapers, the people who are running vape shops, they need to speak out. You look at the history of things like civil rights movements or consumer rights movements on other things. Silence gets you nowhere. Letting people know your views, making noise is important. And not just to each other. I mean, I think one of the big failures that we experience is when people who all feel aggrieved about something set up like a Facebook group and they all moan to each other in the group. Well, nobody else hears them. Letters to the editor, columns for newspapers, creating stories for local media, writing to politicians, meeting with politicians, inviting them into a vape shop. I mean, it is amazing how many people who attack vaping have never been in a vape shop. Some of them refuse to go into a vape shop. They believe all sorts of ridiculous things. And the people who actually spend time going into a shop learn a lot. And if they're at all open-minded, you know, they come out changed people when they start seeing who's in those shops, what's it doing for them, you know, how are the sales clerks interacting with people. and then think of how do we facilitate this? Because we essentially have across Canada now many hundreds of very effective smoking cessation spots. And they're vape shops. They don't require taxpayer money. They pay taxes. They hire people. If they're not effective, they'd be out of business because they stay in business because people are making referrals to them saying, this worked for me, go there, or that it's keeping them off smoking. And the number of them is a sign of the success that we're having. So I think having these shops, get information to local media, get stories, talk about the people who've managed to quit smoking who never could. Nothing else had worked for them. Vaping has worked really well. Talk about the technology of how it has improved, how it could improve, how a market can solve this problem. We look at the history of what's happened in other issues, and we've seen this again and again with big health problems that are solved by individuals taking action.
Would you still recommend that in the environment of Quebec where that could actually be illegal to do?
Well, that's where we have constitutional protections, and I think the role of groups like the Canadian Constitution Foundation and others in challenging the government on this, and just raising the question, even if you're not, when we've had governments saying you're not allowed to show somebody this product, you're not allowed to tell them about it, even the federal government wanting to deny the ability to tell people about the differences in risk between different products. I mean, we have a guaranteed charter right on freedom of speech. And the idea that someone in government would think that they can prevent you from truthful speech that can save lives, that does save lives, that needs to be challenged. And I think, to the extent governments try to shut that down, there's a very good media story in simply having the people who work in these shops being asked, what would you do? What would you do when somebody comes in seeking information and telling them the truth could save their lives? Demonstrating the product could save their lives. And you're being told you're not allowed to do it. You could be fined or you could go to jail for doing something like that. Well, how should people react? And I think the general public would be appalled to think that we have governments that think that that's an effective form of policy, that we will threaten people who try to tell the truth to other Canadians when that information has huge potential to save thousands of lives. Why on earth would a government try to prevent that? And why don't we make a lot of noise about any government that is just so blind that they would think that that's a good idea?
In fact, when I first started this webcast, I had to wonder and ask myself, okay, well, I want to make sure that any conflicts of interest, like the fact that I am a business owner, I do own a vape shop, but I've never referred to the name of the business because I am a bit concerned that that would be illegal, being as we operate in Quebec. And therefore, all I do on these podcasts is say, I'm a vape shop owner and make no association to the shop. But I am taking that risk in a sense. If they, for some odd reason, find that this show is promoting e-cigarettes and putting in a positive light when they believe it shouldn't, I took that risk saying, well, that cannot hold in court, and that I'd be willing, if that would happen, to go all the way and fight for my rights to free speech, right? And to share information.
Yeah, and you can see the absurdity of this. And the reason why we have to fight, the rights that we have aren't things that were just there. They exist because people fought to get them. The whole idea of being able to have free speech, to be able to stand up to authority, to question government, to hold government to account. These are things that traditionally people got shot or hanged for trying to do, and still do in some parts of the world. I think we have to hold on to our liberties, and we do it by fighting back anytime somebody tries to make an incursion like this. And I just think it is absolutely absurd that we have this going on. And if you compare it to anything else, the fact that in the 1940s, our leading cause of cancer death was stomach cancer. And it had been the leading cause of cancer deaths for decades at that point. And it was falling rapidly by the 1940s. It continued to fall rapidly to the point that it's now mercifully rare. And the reason for that was business. It wasn't government spending taxpayer money. It wasn't hectoring health groups. It was business. It was refrigeration. People didn't actually like eating tainted food and having to eat highly pickled, salted, and smoked foods, not being able to get fresh fruits and vegetables. Refrigeration allowed a change in diet. We didn't have to force people to change their diet. They already wanted to. We encouraged them to do what they wanted to do. When they did it, health improved dramatically. Stomach cancer just fell through the floor. We could do the same now with lung cancer and emphysema and the various other diseases caused by smoking. It isn't that smokers are saying, I really like doing this. The vast majority of smokers are saying, I wish I didn't smoke. How do we facilitate that? Just like people didn't want to eat tainted meat. And imagine if we had banned people from selling refrigerators or limited it. You couldn't demonstrate a refrigerator to somebody. You couldn't tell people that a refrigerator was better at preserving food, that it was illegal to tell people about replacing your salted, pickled, smoked foods and tainted meat with fresh fruits and vegetables and meat that hadn't gone bad. I mean, you hear something like that now, you think, that'd be like a comedy skit, a government trying to prevent people from having information about improving their health. And that's what we're getting on issues of nicotine. We have massive misinformation. To the extent that Health Canada, their statements was that vaping is likely less harmful than smoking,
right?
Which is an awful lot like saying that playing baseball with a softball rather than a live hand grenade is likely less harmful. Standing on a subway platform rather than going down and hugging the third rail is likely less harmful.
Didn't they move to the word significantly after a while? Is that possible?
They took out likely after some pressure. So what they're saying isn't that we want to stop misleading the Canadian public. They're trying to figure out how can we get away with misleading them as much as we can. Because it isn't a matter of saying it's less harmful. Because what we would hold corporations to if they were selling a product, and as a lawyer and have been involved in litigation on these things against cigarette companies, your obligation is to explain the nature and the magnitude of the differential in risk. And it isn't good enough to just say this is more or less harmful when the difference is enormous. So that if you're reducing risk by over 95% and you're hedging on that, you're just telling people likely less harmful or less harmful, you're missing the whole point. Our governments would not be saying things like using a clean needle is less harmful than a contaminated one. They'd say it's massively less harmful, and we're going to have needle exchange programs. They don't say that, if you're having sex with somebody who's HIV positive, wearing a condom is likely less harmful.
Right.
They'd say, for heaven's sakes, it's massively less harmful. The difference between life and death in many of these things. We don't say drinking or driving sober is less harmful than driving after you've had 18 beers. We have laws, we have education programs, we hammer home that there's a huge difference in risk. Yeah. And to try to hedge on that, to try to when you've got like 100 Canadians dying every day from smoking, and we're hedging on telling them how they can reduce their risk, we should be shouting it. We should be running massive information campaigns to empower Canadians to make better decisions rather than try to find how can we most effectively mislead them and avoid constitutional problems.
In fact, they want to provide us with strict guidelines on what we can say, right? They're going to, I guess that's in their next steps. And things like if they're going to tell us, let's say they give us 5 things we can say, an advocate that I know very well, she has a toque that says vaping saves lives, and she's pointing towards and saying, well, I won't be allowed to do this once they come out with their 5 things if it's not in the list of things they could say. And I thought that was a really good point because and really what I'm trying to get is what's your feeling? Are you optimistic with the discussions we're hearing regarding Bill S5 in the Senate? And what's going to happen next?
I don't think we had a very valid hearing. As you may know, I was denied an opportunity to testify, despite decades of experience and an enormous number of papers and interviews I've done on this topic, and all the credentials that I have. And when I sent them a list of my publications, they ignored it. The people organizing those hearings, I don't think were interested in anything other than some perfunctory thing, and I think that's a shame. I think we need to count on more in what should be a functioning democracy. I think that they've ended up putting themselves in a fairly absurdist position because they are so keen on trying to restrict freedom of communication. Despite our Charter of Rights saying we have a right to free speech, and when they say we'll tell you what you're allowed to tell people. Well, the point is, you say, John, you run a vape shop. My family's in retail and other things. And, my dad started a retail business when he came out of the war in 1945. He's still working there full time. I know about retail. And lots of people will come into your store, and there's going to be different things that matter to them. And if you're limited, that you can only tell them 5 things, what if none of those things are the thing that really motivates them? Or what if they tell you you're allowed to tell them this in English or in French, but we have a really multicultural country. There's a lot of people whose first language is neither of those. If you have customers where you could speak to them in a different language, in a different way, you could tell them a different thing that would really matter to them and be more likely to cause them to be able to get off their cigarettes, why should you be prevented from doing it? And if Health Canada is so ridiculous as to say we're going to constrain freedom of speech, we will tell you what you can say, then I would suggest that every vape shop start sending in requests saying, I'd like to know whether I can say this, and list all sorts of different things you would like to be able to say. Let Health Canada tell you that, no, you're not allowed to give truthful information on that, no, you're not allowed to make that truthful statement, or in what language? To say maybe I want to give this message in Farsi because I've got people coming into my shop who speak Farsi. And how can they restrict that? How do they just send out stuff saying, no, you're not allowed to tell them that? If it's truthful information, you should be able to say it. We have protections against untruthful, misleading information. We've had that protecting consumers for decades. Health Canada doesn't need to have further restrictions. If you're lying to your consumers, if you're misleading your consumers, you can get in trouble for that. That's why we have business practices laws. We have consumer protection laws. You don't need to put additional restrictions on what people can say, and you certainly have no basis for putting limits on free, truthful speech, and particularly in this case, where it saves lives. We protect speech even where the consequences can be negative because of the importance of the concept of free speech. Right. And here we've got people with an incentive, an actual vested interest in truthful communications, because that's how you build a business. If you're lying to your consumers, if you're misleading them, if you're not giving them good information, you will go out of business. Somebody else will replace what you're doing. You're going to do well to the extent that you build trust with consumers, that you're giving good information to them. Yep. That's what works in order to ensure that they're getting good information. We don't need a government to try to restrict your ability to do that. They should be encouraging that sort of activity.
It really makes our life very difficult. I have customers, new customers coming into the shop who are smoking cigarettes, and they ask me flat out, is it better than smoking? And I'm stunned there sitting in front of my customer saying, well, is he going to be the inspector that gives me a $15,000 fine if I say, yeah, it's better?
Right.
So that's the challenge I have to deal with on every customer that comes in. And if I go and venture off and say anything positive, well, then I'm in a risky territory where my shop is probably going to be closed the next month because we're not tobacco companies generating billions in profits. I'm just one small vape shop trying to help people quit smoking.
Well, and it puts people into a completely untenable situation. So the way I see this, I'm coming from a small town, talking to people who are running vape shops in similar places, including earlier this week while I was bicycling through Elmvale, north of Toronto. the people in those shops know their customers. They know the people in the community. And the idea that you would be limited into what you can say to somebody, or that on truthful speech, to say what happens when somebody comes into your shop and says, John, I've known you since high school. We've played football together. We raised our kids together. We've always lived in this community. And you know that I took up smoking when I was 13, and I haven't been able to quit. And I've tried everything. And my brother just died of lung cancer. And frankly, I'm scared to death at never seeing my grandchildren. And I really want to reduce my risk. And, I trust you with my life, because this is my life, John. And is this really going to reduce my risk? Do I have a greater likelihood of living to see my grandchildren if I switch to the vaping products you're selling? Yes or no? How do you look at a friend like that? How do you look at somebody you've known for decades and not tell them the truth? But
Absolutely.
If you tell them the truth, you've got a government saying, we'll punish you for that.
Yeah.
I mean, that is a completely ridiculous police state approach to doing things. And to me, it's a sign that you've got people within government that simply are not bringing their brains or their ethics to work with them. And they need to. The obligation's on them to stop being stupid. And they're being really stupid when they put constraints in the way of Canadians assisting other Canadians in improving their health. It'd be like saying we're going to ban you from telling people about the benefits of hand washing or vaccinations. We're going to make that illegal. And no government, no health agency should ever think for more than a moment that something like that could be a good idea. We should be facilitating truthful communication. We should be doing it in ways that makes for a healthier, sustainable country. And this whole abstinence-only stuff, that has no room when we're trying to figure out how do we deal with our leading cause of preventable death. This is no time for people to take these silly moralistic views or to confuse vape shops with the global cigarette companies, or just a failure to understand the issue and then to impose their ignorance on other Canadians, I think is really offensive. And that we need to fight back. You don't just take that by saying, well, I guess I can't do anything. You take that and you get enraged and say, I am not going to let this happen in my country. I am going to speak out. I am going to write letters. I am going to speak to the media. I am going to do whatever I can to get justice on this issue. Because ultimately, that's how we make social progress.
Yeah. It's like saying I can't tell my mom. My mom was smoking 2 packs a day. And when I first started vaping and I actually quit, it's been 2 years now, I haven't touched a cigarette. My mom was smoking 2 packs a day, and we managed to get her to quit. Then my sister was smoking a pack a day. We managed to get her to quit. And anecdotally, as I was sharing with Dr. Farsalinos previously, I had childhood asthma, and I don't have it anymore. I don't use my Ventolin for the last 2 years, exactly like my doctor told me that if I continued smoking cigarettes, it would never go away. It did go away. I feel better. I can keep up with my daughter and run around and don't lose my breath. And so for me, it was the best thing that has ever happened to me. I tried the patch. I didn't want to try some of the other medications because of the side effects, but I tried the patch. I quit. It worked, but then I fell back again. So it's like they want to take away all of these tools and throw me back into cigarettes, because, of course, any corner store has a cigarette waiting for me to be purchased.
Yeah, I think it is important, John, in that, anything that we do to be tough on the alternatives to cigarettes means we're being soft on cigarettes. And those who are taking an abstinence-only view, I'm dealing with it with people here in Washington, because of course in the United States, abstinence-only it's a much bigger deal than it is in Canada on a wide range of topics. That when you take an abstinence-only view about sex outside of marriage, you end up with more sexually communicated diseases and more teenage pregnancies. When you take an abstinence-only view on drugs, you end up with a worse drug problem. You end up with more problems coming from it. When they took an abstinence-only view on alcohol, we ended up with a tremendous amount of illegal activity. We have tried abstinence-type campaigns again and again and again for moralistic reasons, and they don't work. And what we do need is to be able to communicate to people, to share life experiences. We talk about the problems of society being less coherent, less attached. People not having the social capital that we used to have. When I experience what's going on in vape shops, we're seeing social capital. We're seeing people interacting. We're seeing communities becoming stronger because you do have people giving those stories of this worked for me, you try it. So when I was talking to Cindy in the vape shop in Elmvale, 2 days ago, and I just dropped in because I was on a bike ride and I picked up stuff at the bakery next door. I didn't know who. I'd never been in that particular vape shop. Mm-hmm. And you're dealing with community where most of the people who are coming in there are senior citizens. These are people who've smoked all their lives. They've tried all sorts of things. They haven't been able to get off it. There's Cindy and Hal getting a tremendous number of people off cigarettes. And their business is viable because it's working, and those people are referring others. And they talked about how rapidly people are getting off cigarettes onto vaping, how many of them then totally cease using nicotine in any way, which is what they had wanted to do. So they've been empowered to do it. And when they no longer need their vaporizer, Cindy says, I tell them to pay it forward, make it available to somebody else, and I'll show them how to use it. So you're having people helping other people, exchanging their experiences, talking about what's happening. You're getting a big improvement in health in the community. You're doing it at no cost to taxpayers. This is great. This is like refrigeration getting rid of stomach cancer. This is like transportation solving famine issues. It's huge, and we should be celebrating it and facilitating it rather than trying to think of, oh my gosh, something might go wrong, we better prevent this.
And if we go back to the discussion about Bill S5, I've had a couple of shows where now we discuss the developments. And one of the things that we thought was really positive is that Health Canada at first didn't want to have nothing to do with vaping. But, we said before, they said likely less harmful, then they said significantly. Right. And we thought that was very promising. But now with the discussion with you, I'm thinking that maybe it's a bit less promising. We shouldn't just jump in and say, oh, this is going in the right direction. They actually see the harm reduction potential. If you can just, I guess, with our closing thoughts on S5, I know you did say before you were disappointed, but is there any hope in the way it's developing, or?
Sure. I think there's actually some very good people at Health Canada. I think there's caring people. I've met with many of them. Many of them know people who have managed to quit smoking through vaping. They've seen it in family and friends. They get it. They're working within a system that makes it difficult to get things done, and including the politics where they have to deal with the abstinence-only organizations, that are pushing for prohibitions and limitations on these products, and doing all the fear-mongering about nicotine or gateway or normalization and, all those sorts of things. So it's politics. They have to play off the different vested interests, and the way to deal with that is, in fact, it's like a soccer game. You've got a team out there. They're abstinence only. They're the moralists. They've fielded a team. Don't stay in the viewing stands. Get out onto the field, because if they're there on their own, they're going to keep scoring goals. If they're there and there's weak opposition, they'll score goals. You need to get enough people onto that playing field that they lose the game. And I think that Health Canada, if there's enough pressure to pay attention to the science, pay attention to consumers, to do on this what Jane Philpott, the Minister of Health, is wanting to do on dealing with the opiate crisis. Let's be consistent here. It's about delivery systems. It's about human compassion. It's about recognizing what we can do to help fellow Canadians. And the potential here, as we've been discussing, is so enormous that we can prevent hundreds of thousands of premature deaths. We can do it easily. We can do it at no cost to taxpayers. We can empower people to make the decisions that they're already saying they want to make. We can give them the truthful information necessary and access to the products, the services necessary for them to do that. I mean, that's a huge transformation. That is so positive, so powerful. How do we encourage something like that to happen and shout it from rooftops? I mean, just get people to get that vision of what we can do, to start thinking big rather than looking at how do we limit options. Look at how do we facilitate the change we want to see.
Well, that's a very powerful message to end our interview today. I'd like to thank you, Mr. Sweanor, for joining me today and having this discussion with me. Is there any final notes or where people can reach you, perhaps, before we close off?
Sure. Well, I'm adjunct professor with the Faculty of Law, University of Ottawa, also the Center for Health Law Policy and Ethics at the University of Ottawa. And if anybody wants to track me down, it's not very hard because I'm the only David Sweanor in the world, and Google's pretty good at giving you information. So you can do that. And I should just say that if I'm sounding enraged about some of this stuff, it's not just because radio makes it sound like I'm enraged when I'm not. The fact is I am deeply enraged because we are staring at a solution to our leading cause of preventable death. It's simple. It pays for itself. Consumers want it. We need to facilitate it. And when we're doing anything other than facilitating it, it's just damn wrong. We need to change what we're doing.
And with that, thank you once again, and hopefully we'll speak to you soon.
All right. Take care, John. Bye-bye.